Since its rise as a superpower, the United States has played a crucial role in the geopolitics of the Middle East. The Syrian conflict has presented new regional and international challenges to the United States in the post-Cold War era. This chapter will offer an analysis of the foreign policy interests and actions of the U.S. in Syria and document its role in the conflict. In order to understand the role of the U.S. in the conflict, we must first understand all of the crucial actors involved, starting with the Obama administration. When President Obama first took office, there was a consensus in his administration that there should be a pivot away from the Middle East and towards Asia in order to engage and balance the rising power of China. A major campaign promise was also to begin the withdrawal of American troops from Iraq. Barack Obama was the first president to openly endorse an Asia-first policy. However, the events of the Arab Spring quickly forced the Obama administration to refocus on the Middle East. When the conflict began to break out in Syria, the stability of the entire region was at stake. Lebanon-based journalist Rami Khouri stated that Syria was like a bank that was too big to fail. The U.S. feared a civil war would allow jihadists to cross the border from Syria into Iraq, similar to the recent insurgency. Spillover was a regional fear. This conflict would turn into the Obama administration's greatest foreign policy challenge. Other central actors in this conflict are the Assad-led Syrian government and their major allies, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. After 40 years of autocratic rule over Syria, the Arab Spring provided an opportunity for Syrians wanting political change to push for reforms in the government, ranging from basic political rights to demanding the resignation of Assad altogether. The Syrian police cracked down on protests, and by the time the government began to make reforms, the country was already destabilizing at a rate too fast for the government to suppress. Many Syrians smelled blood. Assad relied upon his government's ties to Russia and China in the United Nations Security Council against American-led action against him. He depended on Iran for logistical support throughout the war, as well as Hezbollah for manpower. Assad's dependence on these other actors, particularly Russia, would expand as his hold on Syria weakened. Russia has had strong military, economic, and political ties to Syria from early in the Cold War. This continued through both the collapse of the Soviet Union and the transition to Bashar al-Assad's leadership. The main geopolitical importance of Syria to Russia is its port in Tartus, on the Mediterranean Sea. Access to this port is important because it gives Russia both access to the sea and allows Russia to have an influence on Middle East affairs, as Syria lies in the heart of the region. A change in government to one friendly to the United States and potentially hostile to Russia would likely result in the end of both these advantages. Therefore, Russia has a major stake in the Syrian conflict. Russia has had both a strong military and political presence in Syria and has inserted itself in the conflict on behalf of Bashar al-Assad. Iran and Syria became allies due to mutual issues with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Syria supported Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. Like Russia, their relationship allowed Iran to have influence in the heart of the Middle East, and their relationship became even more important to Syria when the Soviet Union collapsed. Syria has relied on Iran under Bashar al-Assad in moments where the United States has exerted pressure on Syria, such as during the Lebanese Cedar Revolution and the Iraq insurgency. Iran, in return, uses Syria to support its proxy in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah, which is an international terrorist organization created to combat Israel. Iran wants to keep the Syrian government in place to keep this connection, and Hezbollah has participated in this conflict for similar reasons. U.S. allies in the region are opposed to the Syrian government for various reasons. These actors include Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, and Israel. Turkey and Syria have territorial strain as well as socio-cultural and historical ties that have resulted in volatility and tensions. Under Hafez al-Assad, Syria supported Kurdish separatists in Turkey. Bashar al-Assad had stronger ties with Turkey than his father, especially economically, but this all broke down in 2011. Turkey wanted to become a stronger regional actor and did not want to appear weak by allowing the Syrian government to crack down on what appeared to be both a democratic and an Islamic uprising in the country, two major aspects of the Turkish state. Brutal crackdowns were occurring along the Syrian side of the Turkish border. Taking no political action would damage Turkey internally. By 2011, Turkey shifted its policy completely and supported regime change. Saudi Arabia and Qatar have similar interests in Syria, and their response was similar to that of Turkey. Opposition to President Assad lies in the greater context of a regional Cold War with Iran. Both want to exert their influence in the Arab world, and the fall of Saddam Hussein's Iraq strengthened Iran and made the battle for influence in the Middle East more bidimensional. Because Iran strongly backs Assad in order to advance its regional interests, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states felt it was in their best interest to balance that effort and to support the removal of Assad so that the regime could be replaced with a government that is closer to Saudi Arabia than Iran. Israel took a cautious stance on Syria from the beginning of the civil war. Israel has always been opposed to the Syrian government, who fought two wars in 1967 and 1973 against Syria, as well as having clashes in Lebanon in the 1980s. However, they have not supported any particular faction, and their action has been limited to movements that have a direct security impact on Israel, both weapon shipments of Hezbollah and assassination of leaders of this group. Uncertain if any particular faction to rule Syria would be more or less likely to either be friendly or more hostile towards Israel, it has officially taken a neutral stance in the conflict. As well as state actors, non-state actors have played an important role in Syria. This includes the various Syrian rebel groups, the Syrian Kurdish groups, and ISIS. For a much more detailed account of these groups, please refer back to Chapter 6. The Syrian rebels are a compilation of hundreds of loosely connected militias and brigades. Many under the Free Syrian Army umbrella advocate for a democratic Syria, while Salafist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, and Jaish al-Islam want to implement a theocracy. The theocratic groups are typically either al-Qaeda or Muslim Brotherhood linked. While the aims of all these groups are variable, they cooperate on the battlefield, often due to a mutual interest of overthrowing the Syrian government. Over the course of the war, the Islamist groups have gained more influence and have been able to slowly dominate the rebellion in most places where it is active in Syria. These groups have received various degrees of support from American allies and the U.S. itself. Separate from the Syrian rebels are the Syrian Kurdish factions. These militias were formed initially as defensive militias against the Syrian government and then later against the Free Syrian Army and Islamist groups. They became a crucial actor when the United States supported them against ISIS in the Battle of Kobani, and later became the center of the United States foreign policy on Syria when they formed the Syrian Democratic Forces. They currently have a neutral stance towards the Syrian government and typically only engage in offensives against ISIS. ISIS formed from the remnants of the Iraqi insurgency that had been dormant prior to the Syrian conflict. They were a part of the mostly uncoordinated rebellion in eastern Syria and distanced themselves from both the rebellion and al-Qaeda when they conquered Mosul in 2013. After Russian intervention made it difficult for the US and their allies to pursue regime change, attacking ISIS became the focus of their Syria strategy. This was to quell internal political pressures and to keep a stake in the conflict. Donald Trump was elected President of the United States on November 8, 2016, and assumed office on January 20, 2017. Like most incoming presidents before him, President Trump inherited the Obama administration's pressing geopolitical issues. Trump campaigned against policing the world, regime change, and nation building. He claimed he wanted to focus on defeating ISIS, a direct continuation of the foreign policy direction the Obama administration took. This was affirmed when his administration continued to support the Syrian Democratic Forces with hundreds of U.S. Marines and stated that Assad was a long-term part of Syria's political future, if the Syrian people permitted. However, he enforced Obama's red line in Syria directly by striking a Syrian airbase, and the rhetoric of his administration has changed since. So far, his foreign policy goals are rather unclear, yet they seem heavily influenced by internal political objectives. As well as a crucial actor to the Syrian conflict, it is essential to understand the conflicts that preceded the Syrian conflict that affect U.S. foreign policy towards Syria. For a more detailed account on these, please refer back to Chapter 5. Syria was one of the only countries opposed to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, likely because they feared the same fate for themselves. After Saddam Hussein was overthrown by coalition forces in 2003, the remaining elements formed an insurgency against the United States and its allies. The Syrian government likely aided this insurgency in order to keep the U.S. occupied in Iraq, although they deny that. At the very least, they kept an open border and let arms and insurgents cross freely. The United States often threatened regime change for Syria. Along with Syria's support for Hezbollah, these factors caused a major strain in relations between the U.S. and Syria. In 2006, Israel and Hezbollah clashed over prisoner exchanges. Hezbollah is Israel's most hostile border threat. Iran heavily backed Hezbollah through Syria, and the war was a month-long stalemate that ended in the Israeli withdrawal of Lebanon. Syria provided supply routes for Iran for arms, training, and support for the militants. Without Syria, Iranian control over Hezbollah would be very difficult, and Iran and Syria differed in their approach to peace with Israel. Syria was open to a land for peace transfer, which threatened Israel's connection to Hezbollah. Therefore, American isolation of Syria worked in Iran's favor. The United States through NATO has intervened in Libya's civil war in 2011 that resulted in the overthrow and assassination of Muammar Gaddafi. This was authorized by UNSC Resolution 1973. This was the most recent example of American-led regime change since the topple of Saddam Hussein in 2003. While there were no boots on the ground, this was a limited intervention that included enforcing a no-fly zone, so Libya's air force couldn't provide air cover. NATO controlled the airspace. This is an example of how many in the U.S. government have wanted to proceed in Syria as well. This was NATO's most direct intervention during the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring began in January 2011 in Tunisia and resulted in either political change or civil war in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, and Syria, with protests across many other Arab countries. These protests typically were centered around both liberalism and Islamism. Tunisian President Ben Ali stepped down within weeks after civil protest. In Egypt, Hosni Mubarak stepped down within days. Something significant was happening in the Arab world. However, the next two major events would be bloody. Libya fell into civil war, and the Syrian conflict escalated as Gaddafi fell. Both conflicts resulted as a crackdown on protests in order for the respective leaders to hold onto power, and would affect American foreign policy in the Middle East for the foreseeable future. The United States was in a difficult position when the Syrian conflict began in 2011. The Obama administration was trying to avoid involvement in another Middle East conflict in the midst of the Libyan civil war, and was worried about the implications if the central authority in Syria fell, namely, the start of a regional war. However, nearly every U.S. regional ally had a reason for wanting regime change, and they each insisted on taking their own actions once there was a clear potential for the fall of President Assad. The U.S. was unlikely to get directly involved, mainly due to internal political pressures to avoid getting embroiled in another Middle East conflict. The U.S. initially would not take any unilateral steps under the Obama administration and would typically shift their involvement into either coalitions or at the United Nations. The United States pushed for and applied economic sanctions to Syria and needed the European Union to do the same in order to put serious economic pressure on the Syrian government, therefore dragging Europe into the conflict as well. Other than economic and political action, the United States corralled the threat of force into a deal that surrendered Syria's chemical weapons in the face of internal political pressures. Also, while Russia and China supported the Syrian Arab Republic at the United Nations Security Council and provided moderate assistance militarily, Russia had had a much bolder military intervention in September of 2015 after the situation in Ukraine became relatively stable. This made Syria an increasingly international conflict rather than just a regional one. This would force the United States to take a different approach. While the Obama administration was hesitant towards regime change in the beginning of the conflict, waiting over a year to take the official position that Assad must go, and only limiting themselves to logistical support, regional allies were providing political and military support to topple the Syrian government. Turkey held meetings with opposition activists to discuss regime change as soon as May of 2011. Turkey wanted to have more influence in Middle East politics, and influencing political change in Syria would be the first step. For most of the conflict, Turkey had left an open border for foreign fighters to cross into Syria, somewhat similar to what Syria was doing at its border with Iraq during the insurgency. They were also funding rebels to fight against the Kurdish factions, who they did not want becoming too powerful. Turkey's indiscriminate support for the rebel groups made it difficult for the U.S. to find partners it considered moderate in Syria with enough power to negotiate a political solution. However, if the Obama administration wanted to achieve its regional objectives, this was something it would have to temporarily live with. The Obama administration wanted Assad to negotiate a peaceful transition out of power, so while the rising hardline Islamist elements of the rebellion could help force negotiations, they could make what happens after much more difficult. While Turkey armed the rebellion in the north of Syria, Saudi Arabia and Qatar armed and financed the rebellion through Jordan in the south. Saudi Arabia and Qatar were financing the Syrian rebellion since at least April of 2012 and were trying to get members of the Syrian army to defect with the salaries they were supplying to the rebels. Saudi Arabia was trying to exert and organize its control over the rebellion, so groups they considered extreme or uncooperative do not become too powerful. Saudi Arabia was hopeful the Free Syrian Army could act as a central proxy for its interests. This would be in the context of the regional Cold War and its rivalry with Iran. According to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the United States provided logistical support for these rebels, and there appeared to be more control over the rebels in the south of Syria than the ones funded by Turkey in the early stages of the war. Meanwhile, Israel was considerably less involved. While Israel and the United States have a close relationship, Israel has provided minimal support for the rebellion. Analysts suggest that Israel did not want its actions to backfire, meaning that any support it gave to a rebel group would be met with fierce resistance toward that group from all factions. Israel has taken a limited number of Syrian fighters into its hospitals, but other than humanitarian support has not provided overt support for the rebellion. They would instead directly defend their own interests by striking arms convoys destined for Hezbollah. The United States tacitly supported regime change through their allies for these reasons, and after the chemical weapons attack in 2013 overtly armed the Syrian rebels that they determined were moderate. In 2014, they supplied rebels with anti-tank missiles to use against the Syrian government. By this time, they were much more invested in regime change, and it would take both U.S. political pressure due to the rise of ISIS and intervention by Russia to get the Obama administration to alter this policy. While regional allies wanted the United States to pursue regime change, internal political pressures ultimately led to relative restraint towards this objective. Recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan provided no appetite in the American public for boots on the ground for another Middle East war. Even the most hawkish members of Congress, like Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham, only want to go as far as replicating the actions of the Libyan civil war. The Obama administration only openly considered direct military action against the Syrian government one time during the conflict, which was in retaliation for the alleged use of chemical weapons. This sparked a major debate on interventionism in the Middle East, and arguments against military interventionism are articulated in Congress by non-interventionists like Senator Rand Paul here.
Now we're going to deter him, and he's going to act in a rational manner. I think it's equally likely that he either does it again or he doesn't do it. I don't think you can say for certain which is better. I don't know that we can say that by attacking them, he's not going to launch another chemical attack. Will the region, I got a few of them, then I'll stop. Will the region be more stable or less stable? We all say we want stability in the Middle East, and stability in the Middle East is a national interest for our country. Will it be more stable or less stable? I frankly think there are equal arguments on both sides of that. Will Israel be more likely to suffer an attack on them, a gas attack or otherwise, or less likely? I think there's a valid argument for saying they'll be more likely to suffer an attack if we do this. Will Russia be more likely or less likely to supply more arms and get more heavily involved in this? I think there's a valid argument that they may become more likely to be involved. Iran, more likely or less likely to be involved with this? If Iran gets involved, more likely or less likely that Israel launches a reprisal attack on Iran? There are all kinds of unknowns that I can't tell you absolutely the answer, and neither can you. But I think there's a reasonable argument that the world may be less stable because of this, and that it may not deter any chemical weapons attack. So what I would ask is, how are we to know? How are we to go home? I haven't had one person come up to me and say they're for this war. Not one person. We get calls by the thousands. Nobody's calling in favor of this war.
However, in spite of Rand Paul's arguments, the actual aim of the threat of force by the Obama administration was to get the Syrian government to relinquish its chemical weapons stockpiles in an agreement with Russia, which came to fruition in United Nations Security Council Resolution 2118. An attack would have only been possible if the Syrian government was unwilling to negotiate. Who even committed the 2013 chemical attack was hardly relevant. What was important was that if the Syrian government were to collapse, there would be far less chemical weapons for extremist groups to collect. It also prevented Hezbollah from receiving these weapons from the Syrian government directly. Barack Obama explains his logic even prior to there being a deal struck in this interview with Chris Wallace.
So my narrow concern right now is making sure that Assad does not use those chemical weapons again. And we've seen some indications from the Russians as well as the Syrians today that they may be willing to look at the prospect of getting those weapons under control, perhaps even international control, and getting them out of there where they could be vulnerable to use by anybody. And that's something that we're going to run to ground over the next couple of days.
Well, let me ask you about that, because there has been this interesting development today. The Russians say they're going to push Syria to put chemical weapons under international control. The Syrian foreign minister says he welcomes that. Right. Will you delay a strike to see how that plays out?
I think it's fair to say that we would not be at this point without a credible threat of a military strike, but I welcome the possibility of the development. And John Kerry will be talking to his Russian counterparts. I think we should explore and exhaust all avenues of diplomatic resolution of this. But I think it's important for us to keep the pressure on and to quote, or to paraphrase at least, a former U.S. President, Ronald Reagan. It's not enough just to trust. I think we're going to have to verify. So the question is, can we construct something that allows the international community to have confidence that these terrible weapons will not be used?
However, Congress was not about to give congressional authorization for a strike. 98 Republican congressmen as well as 18 Democrats signed a letter stating that the unilateral use of force without congressional authorization would be unconstitutional. This nearly undermined the deal that was being proposed by the United States to Russia and the Syrian government, as the use of force was the only leverage it had against them to get Syria to hand over their chemical weapons. This could also be a reason why the Syrian government possibly violated the agreement in April of 2017 by keeping some chemical weapons, with the alleged attack in Idlib that was then responded to with a unilateral attack by the Trump administration. Other than the few staunch non-interventionists in Congress, not many have questioned the constitutionality of the most recent unilateral attack. However, American intervention could have international consequences. A byproduct of the destabilization of Syria, as well as sectarian tensions in Iraq, was the rise of ISIS. They invaded Syria from Iraq when there was a power vacuum due to the conflict, and initially partnered with the rebel groups. Once they broke with al-Qaeda, they declared themselves an independent caliphate. Their gruesome actions were widely reported in the U.S. in 2014, which created a hysteria among the public. This resulted in internal political tensions to deal with the ISIS problem. The U.S. started Operation Inherent Resolve, which was formed to attack ISIS with airstrikes in support of the Iraqi army and then later Syrian Kurdish forces. Their first major operation in Syria was supporting the Kurdish forces battling ISIS in Kobani. The start of the American-Syrian-Kurdish cooperation would prove vital for the future of U.S. action in Syria. When Russia intervened in September of 2015 on behalf of the Syrian government, the impact it had made regime change far less likely. John Kerry stated that the U.S. was watching ISIS grow, hoping that this would pressure Assad to negotiate with the opposition to transition out of power. Instead, Assad relied on more Russian influence. Supporting the rebels against the government would be inefficient, and ISIS had grown. Initially, the United States attempted to run a train and equip program that would arm and train Syrian rebels against ISIS. However, this didn't work because they had trouble getting recruits due to rebels wanting to fight the Syrian government instead of ISIS. The Kurds would prove to be more useful partners against the Islamic State. Supporting the Kurds against ISIS could still give the United States leverage in a political solution. The Kurdish groups were closer to Raqqa, ISIS's capital, than the Syrian army, and holding the city could give the United States influence in the political future of Syria. In order to prevent ethnic clashes, the United States encouraged the Kurds to form the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, incorporating secular Arab rebel groups previously under the Free Syrian Army to be holding forces in the ethnically Arab towns. The U.S. embedded special forces within the group, presumably to advise operations and have influence. The Trump administration dispatched hundreds of Marines to take part in the operation on Raqqa. The SDF is neutral to the Syrian army, and the general battlefield situation in 2017 became a race for who could capture the most ISIS territory before reaching a political solution. One problem with the American-Kurdish relationship is Turkey's opposition to Kurdish separatism. This could cause a strain in ties, but Turkey has their own proxies to have an influence on a political solution. If an agreed-upon objective is to maintain the territorial integrity of Syria, then they could use their leverage to prevent a Kurdish autonomy, something the Syrian government is also opposed to. Internally, interventionist senators are not satisfied with abandoning regime change, believing it's abandoning both regional and international objectives of eliminating Russian and Iranian influence in Syria. One of these concerns is illustrated by Senator Lindsey Graham here.
Here's the question for this committee. How do we leverage Assad leaving when Russia's going to fight for him, Iran's going to fight for him, Hezbollah's fight for him, and we're not going to do a damn thing to help people take him down. And y'all both know that. So when Kerry goes over to Geneva, he is turning over Syria to the Russians and to the Iranians. Is there any credible military threat to Assad now that Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah is on his side? Do you see any credible military threat to take him down, General Dunford?
I think the balance of forces right now are in Assad's advantage.
Not his advantage. He is secure as the day is long. So this is what's happened, folks. This strategy is completely falling apart. Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah are going to fight for their guy, and we're not going to do a damn thing to help the people who want to change Syria for the better by getting rid of the dictator in Damascus. Do you see a scenario, Secretary Carter, where we would fight to support an effort to take Assad down, that we would fight alongside of people who want to take Assad down in Syria? Is that remotely possible?
Our approach to removing Assad has been to...
Does it have a military component?
It is principally a political effort in Syria.
So the answer is no.
Our military...
One of the turning points of this war was Russian intervention in September of 2015. The Syrian government was increasingly weakened, particularly after suffering defeat in Idlib province. If the Syrian government were to fall, Russia would lose nearly all of its influence in the Middle East. Through its interventions in Syria, Russia has been able to engage in diplomacy with the U.S. to enforce nationwide ceasefires for their proxies on the ground, such as in UNSC Resolution 2268, which was a nationwide ceasefire that brought humanitarian aid to besieged areas and allowed both parties to focus on ISIS. Russia and the U.S. have also cooperated over the air. Russia has mostly controlled the airspace in Syria and have allowed the U.S. to attack ISIS with airstrikes through cooperation to avoid aerial conflict. However, Russian influence in the Middle East is a problem for the U.S. because it could create a Cold War environment in the region, depending on the extent of Russia's ambitions. Towards the end of the Obama administration, the Syrian government fully recaptured the city of Aleppo. As a result, Russia attempted to push the United States out of peace talks when they organized talks with Turkey and Iran in Astana, while also unilaterally negotiating a ceasefire with the opposition. While tensions were heightened during the Obama administration, the Trump administration alluded that it would be more open to working with Russia. However, after the April 2017 cruise missile strike, relations became volatile. Currently, the United States is positioned to participate in a political solution to the Syrian crisis once ISIS has been essentially defeated. The Trump administration is currently involved in both the Raqqa and Mosul operations, ISIS's two largest holdings. Nationwide ceasefires are crucial to accomplishing the goal of both defeating ISIS quickly and establishing a long-term political solution for Syria. Interventionists such as Senator John McCain are not satisfied with this result, and there are options to disrupt this process in order for the U.S. to get more out of a political solution in Syria. They could continue to arm the rebels and attempt to create a no-fly zone, not allowing Syrian or Russian jets to enter the airspace of rebel-held areas. While this would likely prolong the war and escalate tensions with a nuclear power, it's possible that Russia also would not want to rapidly escalate and therefore comply. This would be counterproductive to the cooperation between the two powers in defeating ISIS. However, if ISIS became weak enough, this scenario could be plausible. Interventionists undoubtedly consider Russia to be a bigger threat to American interests anyway, so cooperation could only be in their interests if their benefits for players in the U.S. outweighs the benefits for Russia, such as the internal pressure to fight ISIS. While interventionists want a solution in Syria that pushes out Russia and Iran, non-interventionists would argue that U.S. involvement in the conflict achieves the exact opposite. They argue that if the U.S. intervenes, it is likely that Russia and Iran will invest more into Syria to protect their interests. They would argue pouring more arms into Syria would create more bloodshed, with no result that would benefit the U.S., and that this is exactly what has occurred already. However, both sides agree that simply propping up the losing side, which in hindsight is essentially what the Obama administration and U.S. allies had been doing, will only have adverse outcomes. The interventionists want more U.S. involvement so they could drive out Russian and Iranian influence. Simply arming rebels will not accomplish that, while the non-interventionists argue that Russian and Iranian influence would not wane anyway. Overall, the Trump administration's current role in Syria is to oversee the operations of the SDF, while working with Russia and the United Nations to work towards a political solution. As the most powerful country in the world and as a major player in the region, the role of the U.S. is crucial to uphold agreements that could put an end to this 6-year-long conflict. The end result of this conflict, similar to the result of the Iraq War, will likely yield a stronger Iran, a theocratic influence in the region that the U.S. will look to contain, especially in protecting its allies in Israel and Saudi Arabia. Russia will likely have more influence in Middle East affairs than they did before the conflict, and this will have to change the way the United States views the Middle East. As a result of this conflict, the regional Cold War in the Middle East is getting hotter, and a second global Cold War centered in this region could be on the horizon. For more information on Russian involvement in the conflict, please refer to the next chapter, Chapter 8.